Hi, I'm Adam Gerstel, editor of Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania.
And I'm Laura Jennings, also editor of Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. And we're here to show you our Avid timeline.
So what we should do is we have different screenshots of our timeline that we broke up into 10 reels. For those of you who don't know, reels are how you break up a movie. Originally, when it was on film, we were limited to the size of a reel based on a film reel.
2,000
feet. But now, although we don't have to break it up for purposes of editing, we do to allow different departments to work on different aspects of the movie all at the same time. Different collaborations in the cutting room to open different reels at the same time. There's lots always going on in the cutting room, and you want to be able to have different people all work collaboratively simultaneously. So we broke our film up into 10 reels, which is high, right?
Yeah,
comparatively.
It's a few. I mean, at one stage in the process, we were talking about rebalancing, which is what you might do if you get to a point where you have multiple reels that are very short, let's say under 15 minutes, that you might want to rebalance. But actually, we found it to be pretty useful to stick to the 10 reels. There was a natural kind of breakup of sequences. A lot of people in the team got used to where scenes began and, how we ended. There was a couple of early rebalances maybe that we did, but essentially sticking to 10 reels felt good. We had a very large team, assistants and visual effects editors, etc. So it made sense for us to stick to 10 reels.
We're trying to avoid the rebalancing because always in your head, when you start cutting something, it's like everything in reel 4 in your head is in reel 4. So once you've established it, it's really hard to change in your mind what is in reel 4, especially with the director, because the director goes through that journey with you as you're cutting a film, and they know what's in each reel. So if you're working on a particular scene, for example, Gorilla Village, and that's in reel 4, when later you're finishing the movie and you're talking about, let's go to reel 4, if Gorilla Village is now in reel 3, it gets complicated. So we tried to have high number of reels to allow for the fact that things might grow and shrink, because although we don't really have the technical limits of length, there's practical limits where you really don't want to have a 30-minute reel because when you're doing a mix review, let's say, that's 30 minutes of runtime and notes and talking about things. It's a lot of movie to talk about all at once. It's a lot of movie to have open all at once. It's a lot of movie for somebody to have commandeered on their computer all at once. So keeping it small allowed for it to be bite-sized chunks to work on, but also allowed for changes as we grew and shrink these scenes, because we knew that they would, as with any movie, but especially a Marvel movie, because there's just so much in there. There's constant conversations, and we knew things would certainly change.
So should we start at reel 1, Adam?
Reel 1's a very good place to start.
So as is, we're looking at the moment, it's obviously kind of like the final presentation. So as the reels progressed from first assembly or first editor's cut and all the way through, they would have changed and evolved a little bit. During the shoot, we talked about trying to have timeline kind of efficiency and clarity, with obviously being able to label the tracks, which is always incredibly useful. Starting on obviously V1, that's where the dailies would live in their kind of purest form.
Yep.
Then certainly during the cutting process, maybe stack up different versions, different kind of options for performances. I love using the mute tool within Avid, which I can't remember how long ago it was introduced, but the moment when it was like, oh wow, we can just delete
clips
mute
and just
clip here, but keep it on the timeline. So we've got some muted clips there. Maybe there might be muted visual effects shots where there's sort of an interim version of a visual effect or something that has an animation pass that's less easy to understand than a previous version or a post-viz. So we would still be able to kind of keep a stack of those and keep the history of the shot as it evolves, but not show it. So you can mute it on the timeline. That's really useful.
This is definitely a cleaned up version of our tracks, because that's kind of where you end up in the end. And it's worth pointing out that when we first started, I remember our very first day in the cutting room together, we, as collaborative editors, we didn't want there to be Laura's version of a timeline and my version of a timeline. We wanted it to be cohesive, and that it didn't matter which one of us were cutting that particular scene, that we would adhere to the same basic parameters of track layout. And so we talked about old projects that we had and kind of created a hybrid approach. We were both happy with what was laid out. The big difference being, and I think you'll agree to this, you are a much cleaner editor than I am in terms of when you're cutting a scene. I was all over the map with different layers, and I'm going to put this one here. I'm going to mute these, and like using 6 tracks where things are on one and not on the other, and then eventually dropping it all down when I've committed to it. And Laura was always, no, there's only one view of the shot that you're ever going to see.
Well, I mean, not that I made that specific, observation of your work. In fact, I think it was your assistant who said, "Gosh, Laura's assembles and they're really neat and tidy, right down there on V1." Well, yeah, I mean, I picked it up from some years ago working with editors who like frequently did not like working with more than a couple of video tracks, and it just felt like a good kind of discipline at one stage too. And now it's just like muscle memory, as so many of the aspects of editing are with a tool like Avid, where it's just what you naturally do. But it all ends up being tidied up at the end of the day.
Yeah. I do find that as a fun part of the process, is once you've committed to a scene, it's like, oh, okay, I can drop things down.
You can drop things down.
It's kind of like a spring cleaning kind of process.
Right. Just in terms of working through the timeline from Reel 1, this was the opening scene with Janet when she's fighting the quantum beasts. There was a lot of in-camera work, actually, but then, as you can see, eventually a lot of additional visual effects work. There's very, very little in this movie that is untouched by visual effects in one way or another.
The green layer on V14 is our stereo layer. So that's the stereo team putting in shots that they had worked on. And
right.
I believe what if it's a stereo layer and not the white layer, those are shots that were not visual effects, that were only stereo. So Reel 1 certainly had the most, but as we were to go through the other reels, I think that
there'll be fewer and fewer.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've also got V11 for our finals and clip colors that indicate we went white for final. Invariably, during the process, we would be having new visual effects appear on V14 and 15 that we would then be able to check daily, and towards the end of the process, multiple times a day.
Yeah, exactly.
To keep an eye on new visual effects coming in. And we used the note system a lot on this project in particular. So down in the audio tracks on where did we put it? All the way down
track
on A30.
30, we'd use the locators with different colors.
Right.
The colors were depending on what kind of note it was, right? Yellow was a sound note. Cyan was an ADR note. Magenta was a... actually, we changed it, right? Yellow, because we went through so many different machinations on it. I think we changed where we did the black and yellow, right? So black locators were locators that we would put in to alert a visual effects note, and then the assistants would go through and take those locators and send out the notes to the visual effects department and then change them to yellow.
Right, pass them through a database so that we could keep track of notes and not end up with a very busy timeline full of locators. But that was pretty late in the process.
Right.
Like earlier parts of the process, we'd use the notes line for giving the assistants some indication of where we might want some sound effects work done, for example, or specific spot effects that we wanted to be worked on or identify or move to specific places in the timeline. I mean, the timeline as we're looking at it at the moment is very cleaned out on the as far as the audio is concerned. That's we would have had much busier audio, sound effects in all those tracks.
I think pretty early on, the opening of the sequence got a Skywalker treatment, right? That's probably why that got cleared out. It was interesting to put the locators on that one layer. It was always hard. We found at one point, I think when we first started doing, we were putting locators on the clip that it pertained to, but it was very hard when you've got the locators from the dailies.
Right.
I guess as we're pointing out, the way we worked with dailies is we had a couple different versions. One is locators on dialogue of the daily, as well as script sync. So those locators get cut into the sequence as you're cutting the sequence.
And live in the timeline in theory for
ever.
Forever. Yeah. We used local clip colors to identify if something was multi-camera, or so the orange clips.
Right. Although, was it local clip? I think those were tied to the dailies
They
themselves.
were tied to the dailies. You're absolutely right. There's visual effects IDs as well on V17.
Those we just kind of let that be a track that the visual effects editors were in charge of. We, when you have such a large collaboration, you kind of have to accept that there are parts of the timeline you don't want to control, and parts of the time you just need to allow space for others to do their work. So pretty much everything above the filler layer was fair game for other departments. Subcap titles, I think we would participate in, because that would be if we had any kind of notes that needed to visually be on the screen.
Yes, and I used like the subcap titles, and I think V14 at one stage of the process was for dialogue. If we were like writing a suggested line for something, or the subcap titles also included direction for the third floor for previs and postvis. Say there was a version of some postvis in there where the creature was running right to left, and we wanted to change that up and have the creature running left to right. Yeah. That information would get passed via the subcap titles.
And that VFX for review, I think Laurie touched on it, but it's probably good to explain it in detail, that because so many shots for this movie would come in, I mean, this movie was almost all entirely visual effects, where you're constantly needing to see things and respond to them outside of visual effects reviews, because there's just not enough time to give all the detailed notes that a shot might have from an editorial perspective. So we would have those shots cut into VFX for review. And so if a shot showed up on that layer, we knew that it was new. We would look at it. Once Laura and myself had seen the shot, given a note on it or not, we would drop it down to V9. And then, as we said before, Tetrising down, the team would drop it all the way down. But us moving it from 10 to 9 was an indication that we had seen it. So V10 became kind of an inbox for us, almost like a to-do list.
Right.
Anytime we saw something come up on V10, we would take a look at it, see it, and then it was only us that would drop it down to indicate that we had seen it.
If we'd been in a situation where we were working more kind of separately, if you like, we probably would have ended up with 2 video layers for that process, which I've done in the past. So the team knows that both editors involved have seen things.
I'm sure it's always been the case on every movie I've been on. That mask layer is a good indication for assistants and the visual effects editors when we've done changes. A lot of what we'll do is it'll always be cleaned up in one big chunk, and then when we make a cut or something, you can see a cut in the mask layer, which tends to happen because we've done something. So that ends up being a clue to people that we've changed something. And so we tend to not clean that up ourselves, but let the assistants clean that up, because that helps everyone know that something has changed.
So should we look at some of the more, like, where does it get a bit busier? We've got...
Yeah, right, 4. 4 is probably the busiest. That's the beginning Guerrilla Village there, right?
Guerrilla Village, that's the GRA sequence. Guerrilla Village Attack, yes. The acronyms that the visual effects department come up with so that they can identify the visual effects by acronym and number. It's always different from one project to the next. With Marvel, I think they have a very specific visual effects naming protocol that they need to follow. So no underscores. I mean, sometimes you can get underscores or scene numbers at the beginning, but in this instance, it was just an acronym to identify a section of a sequence, or perhaps in some circumstances, the work that's involved. Let's say it's kind of Modoc facial work or environment work.
I wish they would use scene numbers, actually.
Both Adam and I were visual effects editors, so...
I always had scene number as it started out through the 3 letters for the scene and then the sequence code. Well, I would use, back in the film days, I would use key code as part of the shot. I would help, key code would help determine the shot name, because it would track you back to the original footage in the name of the shot.
In the actual 35mm film, that's right. That's fantastic.
And then I had for virtual shots, I had my key code generator where I created virtual key code. Remember, I got the Kodak listing of all the prefixes so that I would create a prefix that didn't exist on any actual film stock. So I think I came up with a system that had the 2 letters were like the month and year that something was shot, and then the footage was the time code related back to feet and frames, in order to create virtual frame number for a 24-hour clock would exist as a key code number. And then to be able to use Avid's relink to take those shots and then relink them later to automatically cut them in and to get a shot back. And I would pass it through and generate an ALE based on the database that had all the different shot IDs and key code values that would then apply that key code value to the shot and automatically cut it into the timeline. That's way more information than anyone probably wants to hear.
Nobody shoots on film anymore.
Yeah, so it doesn't matter.
That's not true, actually. People do shoot on film, and long may that continue.
Yes.
So back to the timeline. Reel 4, you have the first section of the Axia restaurant, or where we get into the chase, is kind of 4 minutes in.
Which is a cue because it used to be quantum ship chase cue.
Yeah, that started to come into play, quantum ship chase, because there was a sequence there that was that would have been, but never was.
But never was. It's interesting also, it's funny that it's called Axia. I don't think the word Axia is actually said in the movie. I think we're the only ones that know that place is called Axia.
You're right. There we are. Another little tidbit.
There's another little thing. That it was Axia was the name of the city in the place where that restaurant was where we met Bill Murray.
Right.
But because I think, didn't Janet once say, she was called the Butcher of Axia?
Yeah, and we freed Axia, but we changed that. Yeah, things get sort of busy towards GRA, and GRA was the very last sequence to get a lot of shots finaled. It's just one of the sequences has to be the last one, and this was it.
This was it.
Hence, there not being very many finals on that layer up there, but they did all get finaled.
That little bit of green, that's an interesting one. I think that is the flashback to movie 1, right? That's the MODOK introduction.
So that's so MODOK is introduced, and then we go to some clips from Ant-Man 1, and Marvel has a big system of nexuses all kind of interconnected in an amazing system, which means that material is available to us while we're editing, and also sound effects and score and everything from all the Marvel movies, all the 31 Marvel movies that have existed before.
It's like they keep them all. So you make a call and you say, can I get access to the Nexus for Ant-Man and the Wasp or Ant-Man? And they, all of a sudden,
there it
minutes
is.
later, you have access in your Nexus workspace. Remember when you load up the Nexus tool on the lot, I've never seen anything like it. You've got like 30 different Nexuses that are all listed. Some of which obviously most of which you don't have access to unless you're granted access. But yeah, they would pull sound effects. That's where we got that. I think because one of those shots in that sequence was actually a shot that wasn't finished for the movie. It was just for the trailer. That one of Darren's mask closing, right?
That's right.
So we had to make a call and they had to pull it up from the archive and they gave us that shot. They were able to give it to us while we were in the room with the studio. I mean, it came up and it didn't take long for them to get us access to that material.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. When I was initially putting the sequence together, I was adding a lot of sound work myself, and then Adam was tweaking that, and our fantastic, super skilled team would take the sequence and then work on more of the sound effects. And actually at the earlier part of the process as well, we were getting sounds and some sound design from Skywalker, from the team at Skywalker, who were even quite early on in the process experimenting with different sounds. And, because it's obviously the quantum realm and there's so many different weird, strange, wonderful, peculiar sounds that can be played with. The director, Peyton had given them real free rein to sort of come up with some really unusual sounds. So we engaged them pretty early on in the process with that.
Before director, right? Didn't Peyton start talking to them? We had sounds from them during the shoot, I believe. Right. While we were, putting scenes together the first time.
Like what would a peculiar sort of subatomic fire sound like? And we would get clips from Skywalker and via our assistants, and really build up the timeline, and some of which a lot of which you can still see there muted. But as we have the timeline at the moment, what we're seeing is the 5/1 stems, effects, background, Foley, and
different movies are different. Sometimes you get to do a temp mix, and then you get these stems early on in the process. We did not get to do that, so our mix, those didn't come in until the end. So we were really dealing with the tracks above. We would have some 5/1 stems that we would get from Skywalker as a intermediate work, as we were saying, but those full.
Yeah, some of those might be on a 20 and 21 there. Some of the crowd stuff, or some of the stuff when they were playing with ideas and they'd give us back some bounces stems so that we could actually start layering things up. The sound mix, so we worked in 5/1, did a lot of sound mixing within the Avid, and a lot of adjustments. So both Adam and I really like using keyframes for mixing music, but also mixing background, Atmos and Walla, and different pieces that really kind of bring a sequence to life.
But we had to mix everything in the Avid. I mean, for all of our
mixed
screenings,
everything in the Avid,
it was all mixed in the Avid.
And we would, obviously, like anything, like you start from a place, you've got to mix, and then you just improve and improve and improve at the beginning of every screening with the studio or screening or an internal screening. Even either ourselves or the team would be kind of massaging that mix. And we use the tool. I use the mix tool in Avid a lot more than I've ever used before, for sort of like a visual reference for the balance of the mix. Much more on this project than I ever have done before.
That was great, the way that we worked collaboratively, because we would, at one point we said, oh, maybe it'd be more efficient if we separated to do the mix and each take a reel. But what we found that it was better if we would actually do our mixes together. So we'd go into one room where it was all consistent, and we would switch. And one of us would be sitting up at the Avid, and the other one would be back in the room on the couch. And one of us would be just watching the meters, just to visually see that anything clips. And you can kind of tell a shape of a mix just based on the meters. And the other person's just listening to give notes. And between the two, we were able to come up with some pretty good mixes for our friends and family screenings. And then we would switch, not even necessarily depending on which sequences each of us had cut, but just randomly, right? Like, well, you've done a couple reels. Let's switch off. I'll do the next couple. And
right.
It made it a really interesting way to go through it, because you're always in a mix. You are dealing often with multiple people taking on that role, and so we kind of used that methodology in the temp mix phase in the Avid, where we're both doing it.
And there were some things that we experimented with a little bit, and like there's a lot of plugins that you can see, and some of the clips. For example, like with an atmosphere, you might want to adjust where that's playing in the room, so it's not right at the back speakers. It's somewhere sort of not 50-50, but sort of 80 back.
Right. And the music too, right? That we experimented a lot with that. And
the plugins might be some reverb or something, just to place the ambience in a slightly kind of verby place. It's the sort of stuff that ordinarily you'd be doing in a mini mix and you'd be talking through with on the dub stage. But we were doing that within the Avid, and actually there's some fantastic tools for doing that, and you can really get the mix to a really fantastic place, bar actually going to Pro Tools. And
yeah, no, the fact that we all did it in the Avid was great. We would put the music back. I think we found that we put the music actually dead middle of the room, right, at 50, and then that would. But we would adjust it depending on the room we were in. Even I think that it depends if the rear speakers of one screening room were more present than another.
Yeah,
and we would have to back off of it or lower it because of that. But we used our cutting room as a reference. But this is a fun story. It was the night before the first studio screening where we were showing the director's cut to the studio, and we had mixed the entire thing in our room, only to find out that our rear speakers were miscalibrated, or maybe they were like set not at the same as the theater.
They were too quiet.
They were too quiet, and so we overcompensated. And so we went into the theater, it was like the night before, to check it, and everything sounded, was it too loud, or whatever the case was, everything was off. And I think we stayed up like almost all night having to readjust.
But we used the stems in the room, so we were able to actually be essentially mixing in the screening room. So it was sort of ideal in the end. I mean, it was a
very late night, but
it was a late night. So we should look at Reel 6, because there's some fun stuff in Reel 6. Yeah. So this is the full reel, including the head and tail on the reel. Around 6 minutes in or so, I think that's when it's the observation deck, OBD. So when it goes to SPR, that's when Ant-Man is diving into the blight, and I think SOS.
Something of Scott's.
Something of Scott's.
Sequence of Scott? No. I feel like this is a common theme on that. Like we ask the question every time and it went in one ear out the other.
There's a couple of things, like there's some fantastic morph tools, which I love and use a fair bit.
And we found the Avid morph to be better than other, like in fact, in some cases we've told visual effects vendors, just pass it through the Avid because the fluid morph in the Avid actually is really, really good.
A very clever tool. So by the time we get to this point in the process, we're only seeing 4, 5, 6, layers worth of shots because they've already gone through the process. These are visual effects that have come back that ILM have done vast amounts of compositing work on. We've got like a section of this sequence when we were first building the sequence with the multiple Scots. So when we were on set and starting to build up the different layers of Paul Rudd's performance, we stacked them high.
You can see each one has a little effect.
And when you get down to the sort of that huge stack, I don't know how many video layers we've got there. Is it plus
26 or so?
26.
Yeah.
There we go. That wasn't all the Scots because obviously they were in the end hundreds. But the hero kind of performances, let's say we are stacked there at 26, and then
that's probably the shot where the tendrils fall in front of him, is my guess.
I think so. So yeah, when there's a huge crowd of all of them looking up, and then the tendrils fall in the foreground. There were many different passes that were done of actual versions of Paul rather than CG versions of Paul, with all the various different approaches that were done to either put his face that was captured on array onto a CG body, or various different approaches were used to vary the performances of all the hundreds of Scots that are in some of those shots. So we were utilizing the Avid, and the timeline that you're seeing now would have been, that's what it would have been looking like when Adam and I were both working on set, layering up those shots using material that would come directly from VideoTap, and layer those shots up and then present them to Paul, and he'd see them and then decide if he wanted to riff on that or add something else. So that's what the timeline was looking like for a bit, and then I think we did some nesting of those and rendering to manage the timeline, and then eventually they would be overwritten by the quick times that would come back from the vendors.
And we can jump, if we're looking at all the timelines together, when we get to reel 8 is when every movie has a final battle, right? So every big visual effects movie has a final battle. So this is when the final battle begins. Often you can tell, as Laura was saying, like in reel 4, with the amount of sound work that's involved. And the finale was no different. And we started working on the finale before it was even shot. So we had at one stage all the sound work that was worked on to storyboards and to previs and to title cards. And often when you start a sequence like this, you end up having to do more sound than you will have in the end, because sound has to carry so much of the weight since there are no visuals. So you end up actually over designing for the sound work and then actually stripping it away as visuals start to help tell the story. But what happened, I think we left a bunch of these here, and I think they would be muted even if right now you're seeing everything muted because we were playing the stems below. But if everything was unmuted, some of that actually still would be muted as we would strip away particular sound effects that were no longer needed as visuals came in. But I like to keep them there. I think we always wanted to keep references of sounds because we might remember as we're cutting another scene, oh, you know what? There was a sound that we were using in this particular part of the scene that I think would be really great here. And if it's muted in the timeline, you can get to it much easier than having to find where the source originally was. When you cut a movie, as you go through the journey of the film, everything kind of gets stored in the database of your brain, and you are always pulling from different parts of it to use for other aspects of the movie. And so it building up is like almost like an organic thing, and it takes on its own life and evolves and gets added to. And so being able to access different parts of it when they're muted or not muted becomes a really great tool. And so having this many tracks and this ability to mute and unmute is something we would pull on to be able to access aspects of our work that we would need in a different scene. And you can see how many tracks. I think we didn't start out with that many mono and stereo. We should talk about that, probably how we mapped those out.
Yeah. And obviously it grew as the assemble came together, and then as more sound work happens. And it's always a good trick to try and keep all your reels laid out in a similar way, obviously, so you can quickly assemble the whole film together as well. So it's no good at all if you've got, a couple of stereo tracks on one reel and 23 on another. So
yeah.
Adam, to your point, and exactly the idea of actually being able to keep a record of the work that your assistants and Adam and myself will do, whether it's to a greater extent it will be sound, but also with take choices as well. Sometimes that muting option is so useful for that, because I just hate the idea of people's hard work just being wiped away, and being able to actually just have it there and unmute and always have a record of it in the most efficient way possible through the timeline is just like a discipline that's really worth doing. And so you're always in a position where you can really speedily set up your timeline, assemble it, hit play, and you can see the movie playing and hear the right pieces of sound and dialogue, etc.
Having, I think ADR was a big one to have muted. We'd have stacks, and it wasn't necessarily always just for us to have access to in the cutting room, but if they're muted but in the track, then it gets to Skywalker. So when you're on the mix stage and you say, what were the other performances of this line? Can we audition them? They can just turn on and off tracks versus having to go back and having the dialogue editor go to the original ADR recordings and building it themselves. We've maybe stacked up 4 or 5 options.
Right.
And we just keep muted. That way they transition into the Pro Tool session.
Yeah, so we're not seeing that here because the tracks are muted, unfortunately, but we did have a color coding system for dialogue that was captured via the array, dialogue that was captured via the Anima setup, and dialogue that was recorded in a booth, on a sound stage.
The versioning and how we named sequences I always find somewhat interesting. And this is something that I think we came together and decided how we would name things. And because of Marvel's process where you screen the movie a bunch of times, we would see each screening as a benchmark. And that would be how we would name a sequence, is everything working towards that. So this particular sequence is called Reel 8 Final version 10.48 VFX Restored. You can ignore the VFX Restored part because that's just us creating this version. But we would have at different stages, Reel 8 EC1 was editor's cut 1 was the first thing. And then DC was director's cut. And then FF1, FF2, FF3 for friends and family.
I find that really great, because otherwise you end up in this situation where you've got, versions in the hundreds.
Right.
And it starts to get kind of just a bit unwieldy. So we use that process, and actually, in fact, I find it really useful for the team as well to understand the kind of line in the sand that comes with each version that's presented, be it the editor's cut, the director's cut, specific, being able to identify certain screenings, and then that kind of gets adopted into the kind of editorial vernacular everybody understands. Also, we may have a lot of reels archived, because obviously each of the bins gets very, very large with the complexity of the timelines, but we might have a version of the editor's cut, the director's cut, and 1 or 2 of the specific preview screenings available to us, so that we could always refer back and use those. That became very useful.
Our bins were big, because we would carry, right? Every reel had the hero version of each particular screening and then a couple of versions of the current reel you were working on. So up until that point, it would be EC, DC, FF1, FF2, FF3 if we were working on Friends and Family 4, for example.
Yeah. And the point, we should identify that would be, if there's a visual effects update, and that kind of comes into its own as you get further along the process, and you're on the mix stage, for example, and they want an update on the picture, and it's not changing the duration, which is very important for the dub stage to know, but the picture is updated, so you'll get a point.
But we'd use that. Traditionally, I would wait till the very end to use the point system. but we used it from the very beginning, so that as someone would take the reel and apply sound effects, for example, they would increase it by a point. And if we would change the length of something, then we would increase the version number, and it would become a non-point. Especially because during the early parts of the film, we were, international. We had a cutting room in London and a cutting room in LA, and working at different parts of the time zone. So things were happening at night, 24-hour cutting room. So we would have to have a pretty tight organization and naming, so that we would know what the latest version of a sequence is. And if we opened up a version to work on, that we wouldn't be working on an older version and someone else was working on a newer version, then all of a sudden the two would have to be somehow combined, especially if time duration was changing. So we used the nomenclature that you tend to use at the end of the movie throughout, to keep it as tight as, and of course it's always difficult, but we tried to be as streamlined as possible throughout because of how complicated we knew it would be.
And consistent. I mean, I think the thing is, and this is like timeline discipline and approaches like this that we're describing. I always feel like it's I always like to give the advice for an editor to sort of set these things up at the beginning of a project, not to the point where you have to be a slave to it from start to finish. But, the more people on your team and the people who at the early part of the process understand the sort of disciplines and the rules around the timeline, if you like, then you don't end up in situations where errors get made and people just understand the flow, the workflow, and can open up a timeline and understand it. So you set up the sort of Rosetta Stone for the project or for the timelines, and your team gets to understand how you work. And if it's multiple editors, it obviously becomes even more important to be able to do that. Do we need to have a look at Reel 9?
Reel 9 was just a continuation of Reel 8. Reel 9 is more of the finale. And then Reel 10 is the fun one because this, you can see the titles, the end crawl, to where there ends up being nothing but music. The little San Francisco montage, and then the second tag from Loki. But the Council of Kangs is another, very much like the sequence of Scott, SOS, the multiple Scots, where we had multiple Kangs. And again, we were cutting this on set in London with Jonathan playing all the different versions of Kang. And you can see that last shot is that one that was the famous comic strip of all the Kangs there. That was fun because he would come out as a different version of Kang each time, and you could tell who he was based on his entrance, and he really personified that version of Kang as he entered the set. These were all motion control too, so we had to be very, very specific about performances that we liked, because each one built upon the previous one. If there was anything that was slightly, although it was motion control, there were certain things like lighting cues and just small differences in the camera motion based on just the track and the servos that might be slightly different between takes. So whatever version we based it on, which is on that bottom track, it was just the order we shot it. So if we shot with Immortus first, for example, then we would make sure that those Immortus takes were selected, and that when we shot the Ramatot takes, they were based on the Immortus motion control files that were brought up, and everything had to be as close as possible and as decided upon, as accurate on the day on set as we could. So we had our little tent, and Peyton would come over and we would review the takes, and we would pick one. And maybe we'd pick a couple. It's not to say we had to pick the exact one. We would cover ourselves. So we'd pick 2 or 3 takes that we liked best, maybe, and we would let the visual effects department know, and they would cover themselves to maybe do clean passes of those, using all of those particular movements. But it becomes a pretty complicated, exponentially complex thing. The more Kangs, like the first one has 3 takes, right? And then the second one, if you had 2 takes, now you've got 3 times, you've got 6 different versions. Then you've got 2 more on that, and you've got 12 different versions. So you had to be somewhat decisive.
And again, the muting tool was really useful for us on set. If I recall that we were, obviously there's an animat there, we were doing like quick animats of different performances. And then let's say we'd stack a couple, and then Peyton comes over and I'll be able to mute, two different versions, but make sure I've got the sort of hero or the original in there, and be able to really quickly just play back different versions of another pass, if you like, so that he being Peyton could really quickly identify which ones were his favorites. So we were utilizing a lot of the tools that Avid, the kind of compositing tools and animats and keying and all sorts to just really swiftly get that comp together, working on smaller sequences. And then we've got Avid temps. I think they'd some of our internal team, which you could see there on that, the clips are green and named Avid temp. So they would have done those either in After Effects or maybe even within Avid in separate sequences, and then perhaps done a mix down and renamed them and have like a record of, so that they could go back and go back into to comps to adjust them if they needed to. And mix downs, you have to be really careful of. But obviously, again, it all comes down to just being incredibly disciplined with how you track the work. And I know we had to do that a little bit with sound and some of the back in Reel 6 again in the multiple scots, because of how much dialogue we had going. There you go. You can see it there in one of the tracks there. It's called ADR mix down. So we were really layering up a lot of those ADR pieces from all sorts of different sources, not just from recordings that we'd done with Paul Rudd on set, but various different places that we'd recorded him over the months, and then built that in a separate timeline, and then did a mix down, but kept a very strict record of, so that we could easily go back to the clips and adjust them and do another mix down. Would that be everything?
Yes, that's our timeline. There's a lot of cuts in this movie.
Yeah, a lot of cuts and a lot of visual effects, as you can. It's kind of interesting when you see that green track up there. It's like that was what was not visual effects.
Yeah. If you go to Reel, let's see. Does Reel 8 have any?
Not very much.
Does Reel 8 have anything green? One.
Well,
one
solitary.
What shot is that? I wish I could remember what shot that is.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for taking the time to see our little timeline tour and have fun with everything Avid has to offer for just making life easier, and, as I say, making it possible just to kind of be creative and come up with amazing edits.